Welcome into a midweek edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you're having yourself a great week so far. Hopefully the weather's cooling down where you are as well. It's been very nice as we inch toward the beginning of fall. Fall officially begins this weekend, and I'm looking forward to all that entails. I know we've already got football, college football, NFL football. But I'm ready to have some more fires outside. I got to clean up a little bit of the backyard, get some sticks put away and that type of thing. But overall, I'm ready for more fall type things as we, really get it officially kicked off here. No pun intended, I guess, this weekend. Remember to subscribe on YouTube, Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube, and hit that like and subscribe if you enjoy all the content we bring you. And today, especially, we're going to have a bit of extra content for you. And just in case you're unaware, Indiana Basketball Media Days taking place today in Bloomington. Mike Woodson will speak with local media about the upcoming season, what he likes about his team, probably give some updates on really as much as he can regarding the upcoming 2024-2025 season and beyond, all that type of thing. It'll also be a good opportunity for some of our guys. I believe Kyler Staley will be up there for us today. We're going to speak with him on Friday about everything that he encounters today in Bloomington as he chats with the coaches, players, and that's what I was getting into next. It's a good opportunity to hear from the players individually and really how their development has been, what it's like for the new guys to be on campus, because as we all know, there is a plethora of brand new players to Bloomington this year, not even just when it comes to freshmen. You do have Bryson Tucker, the only incoming freshman on this year's Indiana Hoosiers men's basketball team. But you've also got a tons of transfers. You're going to hear from Umar Ballo, going to hear from Kanan Carlisle, Miles Rice for the first time. And again, one of the first of many unofficial, I would say kickoffs, but maybe it's more like tip-offs if we're sticking with the corny phrasing here. One of the first of many unofficial tip-offs to the college basketball season. We have Indiana Basketball Medias today. Next month will be Big Ten Basketball Media Days, which I believe is either back in Chicago or Indianapolis this year. I know last year they had a very weird rendition of it whenever they held it up in Minneapolis. And again, all of that was because it was scheduled back when the former commissioner, Kevin Warren, was still here, and he is from that area. And I guess that was more of a hometown thing for him. And again, that's why they had the tournament there as well. And not that you won't see those locations move out to different cities in the future, but it has been typically always held in one of Indianapolis or Chicago. But with the addition of the West Coast teams, maybe you'll see events like that move out toward the West on occasion. So, again, that's coming up. You also have the charity exhibition that we've talked about a couple of times against Tennessee. Again, a very unique opportunity for the Indiana Hoosiers basketball program to really showcase themselves against a good opponent. You obviously don't want to get injured in an exhibition game, even though you also want to take it as a good opportunity to show what you're made of in front of again, I don't even know what the TV broadcast looks like for that, but I do believe they broadcast these on usually the ESPN family of networks or maybe even Fox. But it will be interesting to see what ends up coming out of that exhibition whenever Indiana does get to play in it, because again, it could go a multitude of ways. And if it doesn't go in Indiana's favor, it'll be a chance for people to start griping early, right? I mean, that's what I felt like a lot of last year's Indiana basketball season entailed. And I think most of it was justified. I do think there were points where it got excessive. But then when you got to the offseason, it almost felt like Mike Woodson did everything in his power. And I'm not referring to the positive aspects, but him, anytime he would speak, it seems like he would blame fans, which is not something you want to do. You really just want to take care of business, anything that you have control over, and which he did with the roster, and then let the rest do the talking for itself. But again, that's enough of the ranting on that I want to do for today. Don't want to bring a lot of negative energy. And I'm hoping this year's Indiana basketball season brings a ton of positive energy. And we'll just have to wait and see when we get to that. I'm going to talk with Alec Lasley here in a few minutes about Indiana football. First of all, I'm going to continue to talk about some basketball stuff. Big recruiting weekend coming up for the Indiana men's basketball program, with a few guys making some official visits, and a good opportunity to really kind of solidify some, or maybe solidify is not the best word, but really hone in on a lot of the guys you've been targeting over the last several months and making some final pushes as it gets closer to decision time for each of these class of 2025 prospects. So Alec and I talk about that. We also talk about this weekend's upcoming matchup between Indiana and Charlotte, and not so much the matchup itself, but really where this Indiana football team is right now as a whole. And it's really, again, a lot of exciting things going around the Indiana Hoosiers football program. And again, I don't want to say that it only gets better from here, because we don't really know that, of course, but there could be a potentially a very high ceiling for this Indiana football team. There could also still be, there's a lot of unknowns. They've not really played a tough schedule, and I know no matter what way you want to frame it, there's no such thing as really a bad win on the road. Anytime you go on the road and win like they did at UCLA, that's impressive because of the way they executed, because that this is not really what Indiana football is known to do in those types of situations. But either way, their schedule's been pretty easy, and it's going to stay easy this weekend as they welcome the Charlotte 49ers into town. So we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. But one more thing I want to get into, especially on the football side of things, it's pretty interesting. It's about Curtis O'Rourke in particular. And some people may have already crunched some of these numbers. Maybe crunching the numbers isn't the best way to phrase this, but Curtis O'Rourke's in the top 10 in a couple of different categories on really for the entirety of the season so far when it comes to quarterbacks. I want to share a couple of those with you. Right now, he lands as the 10th best quarterback out of all of the FBS when it comes to QB rating. The quarterbacks ahead of him: Drew Allar of Penn State, Thomas Castellanos of Boston College, Cam Ward of Miami, Caden Veltkamp at Western Kentucky. He was once an Indiana recruit, by the way, not a commit, but somebody that the former staff was pursuing. Jalen Milroe at Alabama is number 5. Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, number 4. Hank Brown at Auburn, number 3. And then the top 2, Ethan Hampton at Northern Illinois and Cameron Rising from Utah, has the top QB rating. But here, when it comes to completion percentage, and obviously one thing that was a big talking point from this last weekend's game was Curtis O'Rourke's ability to make the right play, the best play on third down. He was 9 for 9 on completions, or pass attempts, I should say, whenever it comes to third down, and had over 100 yards in those situations as well. But his completion percentage for the year, he ranks as number 7. And if we're just sticking with the top 10 formula, we'll go and mention who's below him right now. Cam Ward, who I mentioned earlier, number 10. Quinn Ewers from Texas, one of the best teams in the country, number 9. Dylan Raiola, the freshman out of Nebraska, is number 8, right below Curtis O'Rourke. And then ahead of Curtis O'Rourke is Cade Klubnik of Clemson, Haynes King of Georgia Tech, Ben Wooldridge of Louisiana Monroe, interestingly enough, Will Rogers from Washington, and then up to Caden Veltkamp again. Man, I didn't realize how good Caden Veltkamp had done with WKU so far. And I don't believe he played in the game against Alabama, or at least he didn't play as much as he didn't play the entirety of the game. I don't believe he was the starter in that situation. So maybe his sample size, he doesn't have nearly as many pass attempts as some of these other quarterbacks. So maybe Veltkamp being this high up is a bit of a red herring, if you will. I hope I used that word correctly. And then the top 2, Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, and number 1, Dylan Gabriel of Oregon. I do think Jackson Dart is at least current, him along with Quinn Ewers. I know Quinn Ewers, I don't know if he'll be back from injury this week or not, but without the injury, I would say Quinn Ewers and Jackson Dart are probably your Heisman front runners for this season so far. And that doesn't mean that other candidates can't make their mark here in the next few weeks and jump into that race as well. But to see Ole Miss do what they do against everyone they face, and Tennessee's kind of the same way. I know I haven't really talked much about their quarterback, Nico, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name right now. So him along with DJU of Florida State, uh, seems like we're in this era, whether it be college basketball or college football, where there's a whole lot more players where it's a little more difficult than it used to be to pronounce some of these last names. But heck, I don't remember where I was going with that. So if I remember that thought, maybe I'll jump back into it here in a little bit. But I guess I'm going to go ahead and bring in our man Alec Lasley, and we'll talk a little bit more about this Indiana football team as well as what to look forward to when it comes to the recruiting landscape for Indiana men's basketball. Joining me now here on a Wednesday is Mr. Alec Lasley, the publisher of HoosierIllustrated.com. Happy middle of the week, sir.
Yeah, you as well.
Very excited for how football has kind of really gotten off to a fast start. And I know they played FIU, Western Illinois, and we talked about that being a fast start, but it seems like all of that was really, everything came full circle with the pivotal game against UCLA this past weekend that we've all really been pinpointing as kind of the first turning point in the season on whether or not this team is actually the real deal when it comes to everything that Curt Cignetti has tried to build, this new Indiana football team to be. How do you feel like they've executed so far, and maybe have they adjusted expectations for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to say that they haven't adjusted expectations, right? I think just how quickly they've started. I think at least a lot of people, right, thought they'd be 2-0, potentially 3-0. But I don't think the way that they've played has been up to kind of what everyone really thought. I think it's kind of blown everyone out of the water in terms of what any sort of expectations were through the first couple of weeks, especially that UCLA game, right? I mean, I think the way that they started, the way that they were able to again kind of maintain control of that game throughout the entirety of it, but kind of any sort of momentum that UCLA was slowly starting to get there, you always responded with points, and that's something that they hadn't been able to do over the past few years if they did get off to a good start. But the common theme here is fast starts for this team, and that's very difficult to overcome from any opponent. Because I mean, right away, right? They've been up 14-0 in all three of these games before you can even blink, and it's a testament to starting quick with that offense, typically putting points on the drive or on the board outside of that very first drive against Florida International, right? But they responded right away with a tremendous second drive, and then they've scored on their first possession in each of the last two games. So putting points on the board to start, and then being able to limit any sort of productive drive for the opponent on their first drive has been significant, right? Because then it just puts them way ahead of the game and flips the field, and then has a shorter field to go down and typically put up more points, which they've been able to do on every second drive. So you just need to look at the score, right? 150-23 in the first three games. That's a significant difference. Their ability to be explosive on offense and then make the timely plays and limit any sort of damage defensively. I think this, the way that these first 3 weeks have gone, but more specifically the way that UCLA game went, now definitely adjusts expectations moving into Big Ten play. With again, especially how maybe some of these other teams have looked throughout the first couple of weeks in the season.
And speaking of increased expectations, I don't know that these are really the expectations of the Indiana fan base, unless you're just really going all in, I would say. But there's a couple of refutable. One of them, I guess, is an actual human being. One of them is a metric. And that first one, Bill Connolly, I believe he's with ESPN. He's listed Indiana in his current projections, his current edition of his projections for the college football playoff. And I know a lot of people, especially whenever you're around Indiana football and you're used to what normal is in Bloomington when it comes to the football program, the college football playoff coming out of your mouth is not ever something that is seen as a realistic expectation. And even right now, it seems like it's too early to be able to putting Indiana in that conversation. But on top of what Bill Connolly did by including them in his top 12 teams, there's also an ESPN FPI metric, I believe, that gives Indiana, I think it's a 24 or 25% chance to make the college football playoff. And I'll say that one is more than likely based off of the relative favorability when it comes to the schedule that's ahead for the rest of them. And they have some tests ahead. They have Nebraska, who's looked really good the first couple of weeks. You've obviously got Michigan and Ohio State towards the end of the season. And then maybe Washington ends up being a little bit better once they bounce back, if they're able to bounce back from that Washington State loss from this past weekend. But I would say a lot of these kind of way too early projections, if you will, for Indiana to find themselves in the playoff. Most of that, not only is it based off of the execution, I do think you have to give Indiana credit on how they performed, or else they wouldn't be giving them this type of projection. But it also is based on the road ahead for them. It's a lot more manageable than really it ever has been, because they no longer have the divisions in the Big Ten. And because of that fact alone, your road for the rest of the year just isn't what it used to be, making it a lot more, I hate to say easy, but just manageable, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, manageable is a great way to put it, right? I mean, I think in years past, everyone knew how lopsided those divisions were, and knew how much stronger the East was when it came to the Big Ten. But when you look ahead for Indiana, right, it's been all about execution. It's been all about efficiency, and you would hope that continues at some point, right? It's going to be hard to maintain the same level of efficiency that they have through 3 weeks, especially when you get into maybe some of the stronger half of the Big Ten and the stronger half of the schedule that they do play. So then it's going to come down to what they're going to be able to do in crunch time, right? And Kurt Cignetti talked about this mostly through fall camp, is how good they were in one possession, one score games last year. Obviously, haven't been able to see any of that yet, but there's going to come a point when that's going to happen. There's going to come a point when Indiana is trailing and needs to put together, a really good drive, maybe late in the game, or just a response in the middle of the game to maintain that game within striking distance. We just haven't seen that yet. So, as for how good they have been so far, right? I think it's still it's difficult to really see just how good this team can be. Just due to the fact that, right, the first 3 games have not been the strongest level of competition, albeit obviously at UCLA, Big Ten road game is still significant, and the way that they won is still significant. But now after this week against Charlotte, right, we're finally going to see what this Indiana team is truly made of. They still have some home games here before they go on the road, but I think, right, you may circle that Nebraska game is that really big moment for Indiana, regardless of kind of what happens over the next few weeks. I still expect Indiana to. It's hard pressed to find any sort of weakness in their game right now. Offensive line is playing much better, at least to the competition, right? Curtis Rourke has been phenomenal up to this point, one of the best quarterbacks metric-wise in the entire country and in the Big Ten. And then you look at obviously how deep the wide receivers are. The running backs have been phenomenal. The running backs have even been phenomenal in pass protection as well, right? So offensively, you have one of the most explosive teams in the nation and one of the deepest, most skilled teams in the nation when you look at the running back room and the wide receiving room. And you look, it's easy to tell that, right? When Donovan McCulley, one of the best players in the Big Ten last year, especially at the wideout position, has 1 catch on the season, right? So, there's a lot to really like about this offense. There's a lot to really love about the defense. But again, we're not going to know, really what this team truly is until they find themselves in a hole or find themselves in a really pressure-packed situation. And I just don't know if that's going to happen for another couple of weeks here, based off of what their schedule looks like.
And we'll see. I think the biggest test with playing this game against Charlotte this weekend specifically comes from trying not to have that letdown game after you get a big road victory against UCLA in the manner that you did. And I'm sure Kurt Signetti's been preaching that type of message all week. Obviously, we don't know specifically what he said, but the way that he carries himself, the way that his team, or his players, I should say, kind of carry on in a similar manner in which he does, I do think you'll see Indiana respond well in this matchup. But again, if there is a time to expect a letdown, this is probably a week where maybe you do that. At the same time, though, I don't expect it to last the entirety of the game. And again, we'll just have to wait and see what happens on Saturday whenever Charlotte, the 49ers, and Biff Poggi. Have you seen Biff Poggi, Alec, real quick, what this dude looks like? I talked about him with Mitchell Page on Monday.
I have not actually.
So this guy coaches in a cutoff. He doesn't have like it looks like he's coaching almost like little league football or YMCA style football. All you got to do is search Biff Poggi on Google Images, and this dude does not look like your stereotypical NCAA Division I college football head coach. To me, he almost looks like he's getting ready for a WWE wrestling match.
No, 100%. I just looked at, that is not what I was expecting to see there. It looks like there's maybe 6 or 7 different pictures before you get to him without a cutoff on. So I think that definitely explains it right there.
Yeah, and he doesn't have a very good record. He went 3-9 in his first year. I believe he's 1-2 to start the 2024 season. So probably not expecting too big of a threat, but at the same time, Indiana still has to continue to execute, especially if they want to continue to get the respect nationally that they've been getting, really since the UCLA game this past weekend. But we'll move on from that. I know we only got a few more minutes with you. Obviously, a big recruiting weekend for Indiana basketball coming up. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so probably the biggest weekend in Bloomington of the fall. At least what's expected at this point, probably the biggest weekend in quite some time for Indiana. Trent Sicily, Braylon Mullins, Eric Grebe, all on campus this weekend. I think the two most notable ones, right, that everyone really knows about, right? Trent Sicily, Braylon Mullins. If you're looking at anyone that could potentially in their recruitment sooner rather than later, I think everyone's looking at Braylon Mullins as that guy, right? And he's coming off of a trip to North Carolina. He's taken a bunch of visits already. Now it's time where he's actually starting to cancel some of his visits. So it came out right that he's not going to end up visiting Duke. He's not going to end up visiting Tennessee. And we were able to confirm that there is slowly a shift in his focus to some of the schools that have been there the longest, right? I mean, you look at UConn, you look at Carolina, you look at Michigan, Indiana. These are some of the core programs that have been involved seemingly since the start. I think you look at Indiana, UConn, and Carolina probably as those core three. And Michigan probably still kind of fighting a little bit there, just because you don't know exactly what they're going to look like with Dusty May there. Obviously, you have a great record to kind of show and a resume to show previously, but a much different system that's probably going to be put into place in Big Ten action. So a little bit of a question mark there, but Indiana's done a phenomenal job in this recruitment. They've really prioritized him ever since the calendar turned to 2024, if not slightly before. And I think it really shows how much this staff thought of him and what they thought of him going back a year ago or even 6 months ago when he was barely a top 100 player in the country, and now a 5-star player, top 16 in the nation, right? A true threat to be a McDonald's All-American, which was kind of mind-blowing if you take a look back again this time last year, where it was just a couple schools in the Midwest. But this summer, he obviously really blew up that way. I think if you're looking at anyone who could potentially pull the trigger quicker than the others, I think you're looking at him just due to the fact that, again, he's starting to narrow down that recruitment. Trent Sicily, kind of one that's still a little bit of a question mark, right? No new schools have really come in. It's that same core 5 that he's been, truly focused on, I would say, for the majority of his recruitment. And within those, right, I think you look at Michigan State, Purdue and Indiana kind of as those core three, with Notre Dame and then Iowa kind of as the two outliers. Um, Once again, Indiana's done a phenomenal job in that recruitment as well. You look at what they've been able to do with this 2025 class, and really everything's been building towards this class ever since this Mike Woodson staff took over, and they need to hit a home run. There's no, ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is the class that they have prioritized, even when they were sophomores, and this is the class that they have put in the most work for. That they are sitting in a really, really good spot for, numerous top 30, top 40 players, much better than even the 2024 class, with Boogie Fland, Liam McNeely, Derek Queen, when everyone thought that potentially you could get two out of the three or even all three, and obviously ended up with the Liam McNeely decommitment, not landing any of them. This is one where you theoretically can land three, and I don't think anyone would be surprised at that. But that Trent Sisley one is just a little bit hard to read, just because he hasn't really invited any other schools in, and it's been very even keeled for the majority of the last year. And then Eric Reed, right, the name that's kind of come up most over the last couple of months with Indiana, the only true center, the only true big guy that Indiana is actually targeting in the class. So that holds a lot of weight. They've either visited him, or now he's going to come to Bloomington on his visit 4 times in the last week and a half. So Indiana really ramping up the pressure. They've sent assistants, they've sent full staff. Now he's going to be down in Bloomington. So a very critical part of this recruitment for him. If Indiana does miss out, I think there's not a ton of worry, just due to the fact of what they've been able to do in the transfer portal when it comes to big men. So I don't think there's going to be any necessary, freak out over that. But I do think, right, the priority here is landing Braylon Mullins. He basically checks off every box that you could possibly want from an Indiana perspective. And then you move into, some of the other guys, Jalen Harrelson, Mikel Brown, who was just on campus last week, as those two core kind of point guard, lead guard position players. And then you probably go into the Trent Sisley mold, and everyone else kind of falls back after that. But they've done a phenomenal job. It's been a very, very busy September, and it could kind of hit the peak this weekend, and moving into the last couple of days of September with potentially some good news if all things do continue to progress kind of the way that they have been over the last couple of weeks.
Last question. I know that I don't think this happens very often, at least this day and age in college basketball. Maybe I'm completely wrong by saying that, but this is just what I feel like I've noticed. You don't really see a lot of commitments happen immediately after visits. Do you foresee that kind of being the same when it comes to these guys this weekend?
Yeah, and at some points they make silent commits, and then they end up kind of going a week or two, and then get everything set up behind the scenes. So that's become more of a trend. We'll see what happens. Right, things just seem to be kind of slowing down for Braylon Mullins. He had, obviously, I think, nearly double-digit visits scheduled, and slowly has cut those. And I think really kind of focused on a couple of schools here. So again, if you're looking at anyone who could potentially kind of pull the trigger, you probably look at him first. Then, just due to the sheer fact that there have not been any new schools, and Trent Sisley has been very focused on the same core group, then you potentially look at him in the next couple of weeks. But after that, right, it's kind of a coin flip to see who could potentially commit when, and obviously where.
What can the listeners and readers be looking forward to, what you've got coming up on HoosierIllustrated.com?
Yeah, so have a couple previews coming up of the visits, deep dive into kind of where they're at in their recruitments, what's next potentially for some of them, and then good story coming up about Curtis Rourke today. Obviously, the excellent play that he's shown, and really kind of spearheading the explosive Indiana attack that's one of the best in the nation through a couple of weeks. And then obviously some game previews and deep dives into the Charlotte matchup this weekend for Indiana football.
Good stuff. Alec, appreciate you as always, and we'll check in again at some point next week.
Appreciate it, John.
Big thanks to Alec, as always, for taking the time to talk some Indiana football and men's basketball as we are right around the corner from crossover season. And we appreciate him taking the time to give us all the insight he has. And one more little note on basketball for the men's side, especially. There have been a couple of different reports. One I remember seeing from Zach Osterman, I believe it was yesterday, that it is believed that the full Big Ten schedule is going to be released on Thursday, which is tomorrow, being the final puzzle piece to the rest of the schedule. We know who they're playing in the non-conference. We know what MTEs they're playing in and all that sort of thing, but we do not know when they will play each opponent, except for whenever we talked about the Purdue matchups earlier this week. So that's something to be on the lookout for, and then we can really start diving deeper into kind of the path for Indiana to winning a Big Ten championship, potentially trying to put together the best season that they possibly can with this new look roster. And we'll get excited for it. So sticking with basketball, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the troll job that Andy Katz was doing on Twitter, and he is back at it again. Last time, I believe he was trolling with rivalries and fan bases, saying which were the best in the country. And I saw this tweet yesterday, and initially I was mistaken with how he was presenting this. So the actual list is Andy Katz's top 10 Big Ten men's basketball arenas. For some reason, when I initially looked at the tweet, I thought it was Andy Katz's like the best arenas of the entire country. And I thought he just decided to go with who he works for, Fox and the Big Ten, and list the 10 best being from that conference. Well, it turns out I just didn't read it correctly. And he's ranking Big Ten arenas for a reason. He's only doing Big Ten arenas, of course. But here's what he's got as his top 10. And I'm sure here's what it is. This is purely engagement farming. If you're unaware what engagement farming is, it's when you put something that is fairly outlandish on Twitter, social media, whatever it may be, and you more than likely don't actually believe what you're putting out there, but you're posting it because you know it's going to get a ton of interaction based on the fact that it's more than likely something that can cause controversy or be a very opinionated type of thing. But here's what Andy Katz has for his top 10 Big Ten men's basketball arenas. Number 10, Alaska Airlines Arena from Washington. Number 9, Williams Arena, a.k.a. The Barn from Minnesota. Number 8, the Kohl Center from Wisconsin. Number 7, Simon Scott Assembly Hall, obviously of Indiana. Number 6, State Farm Center for Illinois. Number 5, Welsh Ryan Arena, Northwestern. Number 4, Jersey Mike's Arena for Rutgers. Number 3, the Breslin Center for Michigan State. Number 2, the Pauley Pavilion for UCLA. And number 1, Mackey Arena for the Purdue Boilermakers. With all due respect, I don't see because there's a couple ways you can look at it, obviously. You can look at it from the historical standpoint, from, which arena has been around the longest and seen the most success, the most successful teams and that type of a thing. You could look at it from more of a current standpoint, from which team or which arena currently has the best environment. But I thought he kind of hit on that when it came to fan bases, if I'm not mistaken. I think if you combine the historical aspect of it with the environment aspect of it, I think you could automatically throw Indiana, Wisconsin, and even Illinois and Minnesota above both Northwestern and Rutgers. And to me, Pauley Pavilion he solely put that up there for historical reasons. And I know I haven't seen a ton of home UCLA basketball with them being in the Pac-12. And I know that from, during the 70s or 80s, whenever it was that UCLA was the kings of basketball. And I think I may even be getting those decades wrong. Was it the 60s that UCLA really ran college basketball? And it doesn't really matter, for what we're talking about right here. I just want to get my facts correct. But they were, and some of you people who have been around, the longer than I have, of course, are like, wow, this dude is a complete clown trying to say that UCLA was the kings of basketball in the 70s and 80s. Well, it was really the 60s and 70s. So I was kind of half right. I knew 80s. I was like, 80s isn't correct. We got to back that up a little bit. So, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see if Pauley Pavilion really is more than just a piece of history. And I know UCLA's had some decent seasons over the last few years with Mick Cronin. I know they had that Final Four run back whenever they got out of the first four and got all the way to the Final Four. But since then, Mick Cronin hasn't really done a whole lot with UCLA. And I thought they had a pretty terrible season last year, if I'm not mistaken. Had a losing record, I'm almost positive. But either way, I do understand that UCLA is a historical basketball arena. But if you're going to use that scale for UCLA, why aren't you using that with again, there's nothing to show that what he's basing it off of. And again, I talk about this being engagement farming. He's getting people to interact with it because it's nonsense. And I'm doing just that. I'm taking the bait and talking about it. But what the real reason that I really bring it up in the first place is just because it just makes him look like a clown, I guess, right? He does it he's doing it for the sole purpose of the engagement farming. But again, maybe I'm the clown because I tried to say that UCLA men's basketball's reign was from the 70s and 80s. So I'll move on from that, but just want to throw that out there because Andy Katz is doing what Andy Katz does, which is put lists together that really have no business to exist other than to get people to talk about it, which again, if that's his goal, he's accomplishing it. And I guess we can give our kudos to one Andy Katz. And I don't think he's a bad reporter per se. I do feel like he used to have a lot more credibility when it came to really the overall college basketball landscape. And I'm not saying that he's irrelevant, but it seems like over the years, he's slowly become more of somebody who, again, along with the engagement farming stuff, just kind of like says things for clicks, not on camera necessarily. Maybe this is more of a social media thing than anything else. And maybe I'm just overthinking it, but I feel like Andy Katz used to be one of the guys when it came to college basketball. And maybe he still is, and maybe I'm just out of touch with all of that. And I guess with that being said, that was kind of intentional, kind of not, because that phrase can be used, I guess, in everyday language more than I realize. But if you want to check out of Touch, that releases again this Thursday, Dustin and I have a very interesting conversation about something that I reveal about myself that probably many of you don't know about me. And it's kind of a funny conversation. And if you want to check out some nonsense that is not related to the sports world really whatsoever, then check out this week's episode of Out of Touch this Thursday on the Out of Touch Media channel right here on YouTube, or you can check it out on Spotify, the Out of Touch podcast. Moving forward, I want to talk about something that has been probably one of the biggest pieces of college football news overall for the last couple of days. And that is the fact that the University of Tennessee is adding a 10% talent fee to their season ticket prices beginning in 2025. And we all know what that means, right? Like, this is essentially forcing customers, fans who want to go see the football team to also pay their quote unquote fair share, is probably the best way to put it, their fair share of NIL, because with this new requirement, the new ability for athletic departments, wow, can I speak? The new ability for athletic departments to be able to distribute, I think it's up to $22 million annually. They don't want to have to raise all that stuff, all those funds themselves. And they know they have the collectives, but I do believe this is separate from the collectives themselves. I could be mistaken by that, but I don't believe I am. So what they're doing to help out with this is they are forcing people to pay more money. And they're, to be fair, or to give them some credit, I should say, they are being transparent on the fact that I guess what they could have done is increased ticket prices and maybe just blamed inflation or something along those lines, and people probably wouldn't have really said much about it. But because they're coming up front and saying, all right, there's going to be a 10% fee added to your ticket price in order to help us out with, being able to pay our players. And that is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I guess, the way that college sports are nowadays, especially football and basketball, but mainly in the world of football, especially for the schools where football was, and always will be the number one priority, which it is at Tennessee. But this is probably just the first example. And I'm sure now that you've seen Tennessee be the first ones to come out and do it, that's going to open the door for every other major program that wants to stay ahead of the game when it comes to NIL and paying their players their fair share. They're going to be doing the same type of stuff, because if one school can do it and get away with it, which I don't see why Tennessee wouldn't be able to get away with it, because their fans love their football. But if one school can do it, you're going to see everybody else do it eventually, slowly but surely. And at a place like Indiana, it's probably going to be a little more difficult to, not let that be an issue, unless football begins to, I don't want to say they have to be a juggernaut. They don't have to be Ohio State. But if you can, until Indiana becomes more along the lines of an Iowa. And what I mean by that is you're consistently winning 8 to 9 games a year, sometimes 7. I know Iowa doesn't always win those high number of games, but they're one of the most consistently mid-tier to sometimes upper tier football programs in the Big Ten. Until Indiana can get to that level as well, which again, this is only year 1 of the Curt Cignetti era, and we don't know how for sure it's going to work out. We know where it looks like it's heading, but we don't know for sure how stability, what it will look like in the long run. But I can see this being an issue for Indiana football, or maybe even in the basketball side of things. Nobody likes raised prices in general. And again, I guess shout out to Tennessee for being upfront about it, saying, hey, we're going to raise prices, and it's simply because we got to stay ahead of the game. And if it's important enough to the fans, which it is, they'll pay for it. And I don't know the importance level, at least on the football side of things, for Indiana. Obviously, we know how Indiana Hoosiers, for the most part, feel about their basketball program. When it comes to football, the buy-in hasn't always been there. I mean, we've talked about it over the course of this season already. You have your diehards, of course, but there's always going to be that contingent, and maybe always is a stretch, but it's been a while since we've seen the Indiana football fans stay in the stadium for the entirety of a game. And maybe we'll see that this weekend, but you're going to have your fans that leave early, and that is what it is. You can change some of them based on wins, and there'll be times where you can't. So, and there's one other piece of this NIL thing that I want to throw out. It's related to NIL. It's not necessarily related to what I was just talking about with Tennessee, but this is there. I'm going to let this audio clip play from Arkansas's athletic director, Hunter Yurachek, and I'll give him my 2 cents on it after I let it roll, because for some reason I feel like I could do a better job at explaining my point of this once I let this sound play. But here's AD Hunter Yurachek kind of pleading to one of his NIL collectives on why they need to kind of step it up a little bit.
Ole Miss has about 5,000 members in their football collective. We have about 1,000. If we could get 10,000 households across the state of Arkansas to give $100 a month, we would be in the NIL game from a football perspective.
And there's more to it. That's the best version of that clip I can find. But essentially what he's doing is he's assuming that all Arkansas fans, or at least a majority of Arkansas fans, just have money for their household to pay $100 a month to their NIL collective to be able to keep up with the Joneses. There's no really better way to say it other than that. But I saw someone talking about this the other day, or there's some numbers up on Twitter about how the average household income in Arkansas is somewhere around $57,000. And that number may be off a little bit, but Arkansas not really known for being one of the richer states, if we're being honest. So for somebody like Hunter Yurachek to just assume that everybody in the state of Arkansas, all the families that come to Arkansas football games, just have the money to fork over $1,200 a year to help pay for players. Yeah, you're going to have some households who can do that. But the average family, especially in the state of Arkansas, does not want to fork over that amount. And maybe I'm wrong. And I know Yurachek is likely coming from the perspective like this dude's a made man. He makes millions of dollars a year. I mean, most athletic directors, they can live with higher means than, and I say most, I mean, athletic directors make a ton of money. All athletic directors, especially of major collegiate programs, they've got it made. They can do nearly whatever they want with their money and not have to blink an eye about it, if that's even a phrase. But again, another way to use out of touch here. It's a very out of touch thing for him to say, just assuming that that there's enough families in Arkansas that are willing to fork up. He said 10,000 families. And again, maybe 10,000's a lot smaller of a number than I realize, but just on the surface, asking 10,000 households to give $100 a month for NIL, I just don't see that happening. But here, he's doing his job. He's making the pitch because he wants his athletic programs to succeed. I get why he's doing it, but it just seems like he's coming from a place that isn't where the average fan would be, if that makes sense. So just wanted to throw that out there. Hopefully that made sense to you guys. Hopefully, and it's not I'm not saying that. I feel like the way I phrased that made it seem like I'm talking down to you. Hopefully I did a good enough job at laying out what I was trying to talk about when it comes to that type of stuff. But we'll move on from some of this NIL discussion and get into a couple of other things before we wrap up this episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports. Moving back to the Big Ten, got a little bit of quarterback news when it comes to a couple of different programs to be, as they move forward in their next parts of the season. We'll start off with Wisconsin. They unfortunately lost Tyler Van Dyke during their matchup with Alabama over the weekend, suffered an injury that ended up being not very good for him, obviously. Tore his ACL, and that will do it for his, the remainder of the season for him, unfortunately. And that's ACL injuries. Indiana fans are not unfamiliar with that. They are very familiar with it, unfortunately, with not this year, of course, but in previous seasons when they had Michael Penix and, even a couple of other players. I don't know. For some reason, Michael Penix, obviously those were just that was a very important player to lose back for the Hoosiers whenever they had a very poor offensive line. Injuries were a lot more frequent for Indiana back then. But Wisconsin will have to move on without Van Dyke, and they will be replacing him with Braden Locke, who did play against Alabama on Saturday. And just unfortunate to see anybody go down. And whenever it's somebody like that, especially at the quarterback position, it likely changes the trajectory of your season drastically. So that's another thing. Like when we talk Indiana, if we lose somebody, I shouldn't say we. I feel like for the most part, I do a pretty good job at not saying we because I know I'm not a part of the team. But when Indiana, if they were to lose somebody like Curtis Rourke, who is putting up numbers that Indiana fans have not seen since Nate Sudfeld, if he were to go down for any reason, that will change the trajectory of the season in some way, shape, or form. Yes, you likely have a capable backup in Taven Jackson, but it's not somebody who has proven anything at the level in which Curtis Rourke has done so far this season. So it's just unfortunate to see anybody go down, especially with an ACL tear. So Wisconsin will be moving on from that and trying to make the most of their season with Braden Locke. And then on Michigan's side of things, they didn't have an injury, but they are moving on to Alex Orji. And yes, that is his name, Orji. It is not spelled with the inappropriate way of Orgy, if we're just being clear here. But that is his name, Alex Orji. And spelled O-R-J-I for those who may be interested. He'll be coming out against USC on Saturday, thrust into a big-time matchup. And we all know Michigan did not look the part a couple of weeks ago when they took on Texas at home. This time they'll get a chance at USC, who already has a marquee victory against the LSU Tigers. And this will be a big moment for Sharon Moore. He wants to be able to show people that Michigan is still on the same level as the big boys with, again, USC, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. They want to be on that same level. And I know I've been saying it since the beginning of this season. I don't necessarily expect a quarterback change to make a huge difference here. I mean, obviously he's trying something. So the guy who Alex Orji is replacing, Davis Warren's only thrown 2 touchdowns this season and has 6 interceptions. And so he's likely just trying to make a move while it's still early in the season. And, you know, he wants his team to be competitive, as I stated earlier. So a couple of changes at QB around a couple of big-time Big Ten programs, if I do say so myself. I want to move on to some more expansion news. It feels like everywhere you look, there's expansion news popping up all over the place at random times of the year. Last time it was the Mountain West getting a little gutted by the Pac-12. The Pac-12 trying to stay alive, and they are now being targeted once again. The Mountain West is not by the Pac-12 this time, but by the American Athletic Conference. And with that, they are trying to complete the trifecta, if you will, the triumvirate, however you want to phrase it. They want to bring in the Service Academy, the Air Force. Therefore, and what I mean by the triumvirate, if the American is able to bring on Air Force, they will now have Air Force, Navy, and Army all in the same conference for the first time in their histories. And it seems very fitting when you are a conference that is called the American Athletic Conference. There aren't many things more American than the service academies, right? And then that would bring the American to a total of 14 teams, a part of their conference. And that would include UAB, East Carolina, Florida Atlantic, Memphis, UNC, North Texas, Rice, USF Temple, UTSA, Tulane, Tulsa, and Wichita State. That doesn't even include the service academies. I guess so. They're affiliates in certain for football. So I guess we would move up to what, 17, something along those lines when you include the service academies. Some of these, when you have full affiliates versus part-time affiliates, it just gets kind of weird. But you would have Navy, Army, and Air Force in football in the American Athletic Conference, and maybe at that point, the American becomes the Premier League in the group of 5. And maybe that's already the case when you think about the schools who have already left the Mountain West, or I should say have already been plucked for the future seasons of the Pac-12. Again, I still think that situation is very weird in general, but I do think the American is trying to position themselves as, you know what, someone's got to be the best in the group of 5, and it might as well be us. If the Mountain West is going to be taken, then let's continue to make sure that if the lower level leagues want to expand, that they want to move on to the American. And again, maybe that means down the line that the American starts getting gutted. Whenever maybe the conference is like the Big 12 or the ACC, in order to stay alive, they try to bring in some of the bigger brands from the American Athletic Conference. Now, I do think that can only take you so far, because one thing that makes like the ACC specifically unattractive is their grant of rights deal with ESPN, and how long you're locked into that whenever you could join other conferences who have less restrictive rules, I guess, if that makes sense, and maybe even better revenue sharing. It just kind of depends on the way you look at it, I guess. But I mean, maybe any of these G5 teams would welcome any invite to the Power 5, even if it is the ACC, that it seems like most of their members would rather escape than be a part of that league. And if I were guessing, if the ACC is ever able, if any of the teams in the ACC, I should say, are able to find a way out of that grant of rights, which I don't know what they would find, because I believe Florida State and Clemson have already been looking into that for some time, then the ACC will be the next power conference to likely falter. And at that point, you would have them scrambling, likely trying to move on to the Big 12 or even the Big 10 of the SEC. I know the Big 10 they'll expand anywhere. They've already shown that. And the biggest brand left when it comes to true conference expansion and something that can help your conference take a step forward in terms of value. There's really only one brand left that moves the needle more so than any other program, and that's Notre Dame. With their NBC deal alone, they get, I believe, $50 million a year from NBC in their contract. That's more than any of the SEC schools currently get with, I think, and again, it's not by a lot. I believe SEC schools are getting $49.9 million per school for their TV rights deal with ESPN. So again, it's barely less than what Notre Dame's getting. But for Notre Dame to be able to be independent and have that kind of value, be a national brand, the Fighting Irish, then that shows that any conference would love to add Notre Dame if Notre Dame ever felt the need to join a conference. Because that's the other thing with them. They're not going to join unless there's nowhere left to go. And what I, like basically just, and I say nowhere left to go, they're not looking for anywhere to go in the first place unless their only option is to join a conference. So, and I don't know if that time will ever come, especially in the near future. Maybe if Notre Dame just begins to struggle and, with this new college football playoff format and they struggle to get in without being in a conference, maybe that is what would be kind of the final domino for them to join the Big Ten of the SEC, because that's what's going to happen. I guess maybe the only other scenario I could see, because they're already a part-time member of the ACC, if the ACC ever became a more attractive fit for them for, in regards to their TV deal, maybe they would just stick with the ACC. But maybe they could stay in the ACC for every other sport and join the Big Ten and the SEC in football, or the SEC in football, I should say. So all of this is just a massive puzzle that will likely never be fully solved. I know we've kind of joked here and there before about how maybe down the road it just becomes the Big Ten versus the SEC and none of the other major conferences exist, and it becomes the Power Two, and essentially like the NFL Junior. You'd have the AFC, the NFC, instead of the Big Ten and the SEC in just one big league together. If that happens, I don't see that happening maybe 10 years down the road, but who really knows? My opinion also doesn't really matter. What the hell do I know when it comes to what these commissioners are thinking when it comes to expansion and that type of stuff? So we'll leave that there. It's a long-winded way of me saying that the Air Force may join the American Athletic Conference down the road. And I guess we'll keep an eye on it. Because, again, the more dominoes that fall in expansion, the more we'll step up to the plate. And you'll see other brands being targeted. And maybe the Mountain West will no longer exist here in a couple of years. So we'll move forward. And we'll go ahead and wrap up with one thing that I've done, I believe, the last couple of Wednesdays. I'm going to try to make this a regular thing. We're going to shout out the non-revenues, men's soccer, women's soccer, and volleyball. And as we get further into the season, I'll try to continue to bring in some of the other programs. I do believe the only major ones that are currently in action are men's soccer, women's soccer, and women's volleyball. But men's soccer is still trying to find their footing. They did get a win at Rutgers this past Friday, 1-0. But they followed that up with the draw against Evansville yesterday. And again, usually these Indiana men's soccer teams, they are the gold standard really of Indiana athletics in general. I know they're men's swimming and diving, or maybe swimming and diving in general, I should say. They brought in several national championships, but men's soccer right along there with them with their eight, excuse me. Can I speak today? With 8 national titles, they've been going for that 9th and have had many opportunities already in the last several years to get that 9th star, but they have not been able to do so. And again, they're off to a slow start this year, 2-2-3, with, again, plenty of season left, but you do want to turn it around sooner rather than later so that you can carry some momentum as you get closer to the postseason. So again, we'll try to keep an eye on men's soccer here and there. Women's soccer, unfortunately, suffered their first loss of the season this past weekend, or I should say, I guess it was right before the weekend on Thursday. Lost to Ohio State 3-0. And again, before that, they had several dominant performances and coming up, they're playing all 4 new Big Ten teams back to back. 2 of them at home, UCLA and USC, and then they will travel out west to face Oregon and Washington in back-to-back games before returning back to the Midwest. So we'll see how women's soccer can do as they take on the newbies of the Big Ten Conference. And then finally, women's volleyball, they took care of business in the Indiana Invitational this past weekend, defeated Chicago State 3-1, Southern Indiana 3-0, and Ball State 3-2. And coming up this weekend, they will face Notre Dame in South Bend on Friday. And then Notre Dame will come back to Bloomington on Sunday, the 22nd. And I don't know if that's common to do. That's an interesting way to schedule some games right there. And the Friday game will be on ACC Network Extra with the Sunday matchup on Big Ten Plus. So that is how your non-revenue sports are doing in the IU athletics landscape. And again, each Wednesday, I'm going to try to remember to shout out the non-revenue sports. Maybe I should stop calling them non-revenue sports. It almost feels like an insult. It is what it is. That's what they are. But I don't mean for that to come off as a negative thing. So we'll go ahead and wrap up today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. We'll be back on Friday. Plan on talking with Jeffrey the Greek, get a little update on his perspective on this Indiana football team a quarter of the way through the season. Also plan on talking with Kyler Staley about all that he learns from Indiana basketball media days. And hopefully we'll have some sound of our own to share that could give us some interesting talking points to go off of on Friday as well. So until then, again, if you enjoy everything that we put on this channel, subscribe on Hoosier Illustrated and check out everything going on HoosierIllustrated.com as well from Alec, Kyler, and the whole gang. We appreciate it as always. So until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.